Okay, we're live. So thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the Ujazdowski Castle Centre for Contemporary Art. This is the sixth and final of our Culture Tension series, which Agnieszka Koleg and myself have been curating. Come in, welcome. So my name is Manik Govinda. I live in London and I've been co-curating this program with Agnieszka, and we've had a fantastic year of really potent and provocative and necessary public discussions on art and migration, identity politics, the sacred and the profane, the European Union and propaganda art. And this one is, I think, an interesting topic for us to discuss because it's a kind of an overarching thing about postmodernism, and some people will not know what postmodernism is. You get a blank look; no one knows what it is. But we are living in a postmodern moment, and we'll kind of see that when we start hearing our fantastic speakers' presentation. So, I'm not going to talk too much because we got a range of really good presentations. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in order of their presentation. So firstly, my co-curator, Agnieszka Koleg, who is also a deputy director at the Ujazdowski. But Agnieszka is also an artist, a curator, and she was co-founder of the Passion for Freedom Arts Festival, which took place in London. And the festival supported artists who were usually, mainly forbidden to exhibit their art. She exposed the silences of many and challenged the comfortable positions of those who inhibit safe spaces. Agnieszka bravely and courageously survived the terror attack in Copenhagen in 2015. However, she continued the meeting on art and blasphemy after the attack by saying they not only want to kill us, they want to stop us talking, so therefore we should continue talking. Second, I'd like to welcome Rachel Ura, her first visit to Warsaw, and we've come to a lovely snowy Warsaw, so welcome, Rachel. Rachel is an incredibly brilliant artist who works as a conceptual artist, so that's quite apt in the sort of postmodern age, but also very strong. You would say you're a feminist also. But you work with data, and you explore the relationship between gender, technology, and the systems of power. Rachel graduated with a fine art degree from Goldsmiths College in London, and she also won the prestigious Burston Award. She is a multidisciplinary artist with a diverse set of skills, working around art and technology and installation. But also you fabricate everything.
Yes, I do.
Which is fantastic. It's very rare to meet artists working in very complex materials who make their own installations. You were artist in residence at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2017, and also showed at the Whitechapel Gallery, Barbican Centre, and many other well-known galleries, both in the UK, but also in South Korea and beyond. Rachel was featured as one of the 100 sculptors of tomorrow, and is also one of the top 50 women sculptors. So I look forward to hearing what your thoughts, Rachel. Next, we're going to have Mariusz. So Mariusz, welcome. And it's lovely to have you here. Mariusz is going to speak in Polish, but you will. We've got headsets, and it will be translated into English. Mariusz is a scriptwriter, a journalist, a very important writer, and he's written for many publications in Poland. Forgive my pronunciations, they're going to be very hard to pronounce, but the daily newspaper, the Rzeczpospolita. Rzeczpospolita. Thank you. Please forgive me. Various newspapers, and he's written a collection of short stories with some wonderful titles such as Funny Lovers, The Feast of Assumption, How I Became Prime Minister, and that was in 2012. And I think quite significantly, next year there's going to be the first feature film biography of the very famous Polish writer Bruno Schulz. So I think we'll all look forward to that, and I hope we see it in the UK. Marius has written the script, and it's going to go into production in 2023. Finally, we're going to have Esme Partridge. Esme Partridge is on screen. Due to unforeseen circumstances, she can't be here. But we have her. The beauty of new technology and digital technology, smart technology, which is very postmodernist, is that Agnieszka is with us. Her presence Esme is with us. And Esme is a wonderful writer. She's also studying at philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge. She specializes on religion, particularly on Islamic thought, and the confrontation between tradition and modernity. She's been exploring the digital forms of spirituality, so that's going to be quite fascinating to talk about and talk further on. She wrote her Bachelor of Arts dissertation on Gen Z witchcraft and its relationship to postmodernism. She graduated with the first from the School of Oriental and African Studies in University of London, and she's written for many publications. One is the journal at the Zaytuna College. She's also written for Arab Blitz Quarterly, the Muslim Institute, as well as Critic, Unheard, and the Royal Society of Arts. So Esme works at the intersection of religion and politics, and has worked on a number of interfaith and initiatives on freedom of religion or belief. She's also the secretariat of a parliamentary group in the UK on Christianity in the Middle East, and her work has been featured by the Church Times, the Irish Catholic, and The Week, amongst many others. And you've done so much for such a young woman, Esme, so welcome. You're probably our youngest speaker, which is great.
Thank you very much.
Right, so we're going to start with that. Agnieszka, you're going to show some slides and give an introduction.
Yes, please. Can I get the slides? So first of all, I would like to say thank you to Miriam Elia, who agreed to feature one of her images from the book We Go to the Gallery. That's been used for our poster to advertise our event. And I wanted to show a few other images from the book, We Go to the Gallery. And I have to say that I've been torn because at first I wanted to show just the images, but then I started to think about the subject, and I thought that I might not have a chance to talk about it later on. So I will try to combine the thoughts I had for our meeting together with the images of Miriam's work. So this is the first one, God, Dead, Confused. And I went back to the memories of when we started the festival in London, Passion for Freedom, in 2009. And at that time, we were asking 3 questions. What is freedom? How easy is it to lose it? And how hard is it to get it back? And the questions we raised was really having a great response from artists, and the festival was developing. But with time, we started to notice a shift in the culture, that it was very hard to talk about losing freedom and getting it back when people don't really appreciate or don't even understand what freedom is. And in 2018, we decided to actually rephrase the questions and to talk about how you preserve it, how do you celebrate it, so then people can focus also on what does it mean really, what is really freedom, and why is it worth preserving? Because we saw this trend where with relativization of values, of system of values, where in a sense it felt that if we are getting attacked by a terror attack, it's maybe our fault and we should actually apologize that even someone has to bother to attack us. And I remember that I was shocked by the example of the Manchester Arena attack where 23 people died. Among them, there were Polish parents waiting for their daughters to come out of the concert, and 800 people were injured. The inquest found that the security guard did not want to approach the suspect after tip-offs from relatives waiting for the girls to come out because he was afraid to be considered racist. So this has been ringing in my ears, and this is one of the issues that I would like to see whether there would be a chance to address, maybe together with the audience, maybe with our viewers on YouTube, whether we're not making ourselves weak and vulnerable to the attacks of people that have very strong systems of values and they don't budge, they don't apologize, they act on it. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Nerves. This one I find quite endearing, maybe because I'm an artist myself. and it's a theme, obviously, between artists, female artists, to talk about it. What I love about Miriam's work is that there's lots of sense of humor in it, but still you can think about really big and important issues, but at the same time laugh. This Manik touched in his piece, the curatorial piece. We were talking about what is the connection between postmodernist art and capitalism and actually globalization, and who's really benefiting, who's making the biggest money, who's actually consuming this work. So that really plays well into that part of your piece. That is something quite common with artist statements and different pieces written by the students at art colleges around the Western world. Using a jargon, using a really complex, complicated language, and getting to this stage where it's not really important. You're not supposed to understand. Actually, that kind of gives even higher quality to the work if nobody can understand. And I think that kind of goes back to my first question, whether we're not making ourselves vulnerable and whether it's not actually some kind of a self-defeating behavior that we're performing at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka, and I think that was a good context from an artistic point of view, because parody is something that I would say is a very strong feature of postmodernism. Okay, so we're going to now move to Rachel. Rachel. Okay, we've got our slides ready.
Waiting for the first slide.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Right. Good evening, and thanks for inviting me to this panel discussion. I'm going to try and speak slowly for the translators. That is on?
Yeah,
it is. Okay. In the preamble to this talk, Manik questioned whether postmodernism was anti-authoritarian or anti-truth. I mean, personally, I believe much of what I'm seeing is and experiencing is anti-truth, and the gatekeepers of this have themselves become authoritarian in rigorously maintaining the systems of belief, but would probably call themselves anti-authoritarian. The whole world seems to become a game of opposites, and frankly, if you spend too long engaging with it, you could quite easily lose your grasp on reality and sense of being. I'm sure underpinning all of this are many hidden agendas. The trouble is, so much of this has seeped into real life that one can no longer turn a blind eye to the effects. I'm a visual artist, not an academic or writer, so I use my art to express myself and make sense of the world. So I'm going to talk a bit about my work in the context of some of the subjects that we'll be discussing tonight. I work across many mediums. I've made films, sculptures, installations, and performances. I work in the medium most applicable to what I'm dealing with at the time. I very much live and work in the real world, and my work is a distillation of these experiences, helping me make sense of what's going on. I have a practical background of 30 years in the tech industry, mostly programming and design, and I'm also a trained cabinet maker. I fabricate most of the work myself, and when I do need a specialist skill that I can't learn on YouTube, I seek to employ a woman to do the job. I'm an active feminist, one who centres women, which probably led to my spectacular cancellation in 2019, which I'll touch on later. My main preoccupations are technology, feminism, and the truth, or more to the point, why people lie. Is it a hidden agenda, stupidity, or something I'm not aware of? I'm also fascinated by the mechanisms put in place to conceal the truth and maintain these lies. We seem to be living in a world where language is ever increasingly twisted and distorted. It's aimed to obfuscate and confuse. On the slide here is a work I made in 2016. It's called Cocksure. Is anything ever what it seems? Cocksure means being confident in an excessive or arrogant way. I also like the play on words. The idea of this work came when I was attending a conference on technology and digital art at a UK university, and one of the panelists was speaking on a subject that I was a specialist in. What he was saying was simply uninformed and factually incorrect. I was also very aware that he was delivering his talk with such unquestioning confidence. I then started watching the audience, some of who were taking notes, and thought how this misinformation would probably make its way into essays and articles, very likely historicizing itself. I instinctively noted down, bullshit said with confidence becomes the truth. I think this can be applied to many areas in life, especially politics. That's good. At the time I was making this, I was designing the neon for another work in a CAD program, so I drew this in the software and then rendered it, so the work actually doesn't exist. Shall I do the, do you want to do the next one? Okay, carry on. There's 3 slides just to show you the drawing process, because I very much enjoy the process of the work. If you notice in the main image, I also reference some previous work that I'd done about the death of the artist Anna Mendieta, who was allegedly killed by her husband, Carl Andre, in 1985. His work, The Way West, was seated opposite the neon, and this caused a big divide in the art world. So that's the drawing to the next one now. I mapped the light trajectory for the first time of her murder, from the time of her murder to her body, the time her body was removed. The scene was never documented, and this was a proposal for a public sculpture. Basically, he got away with her murder, having been financially backed in his court case by some of the wealthy male artists in New York. The female artist supporting Anna's case had less financial clout. The evidence pointed of him being guilty, but highly paid lawyers used technicalities to stop him being convicted. Interestingly enough, in a lecture I gave about this work a couple of years ago, I was asked whether, as a white person, what right I had to talk about Anna Mendieta. It could be seen as an interesting topic of discussion, but given the atmosphere, some of the students who were angry at my presence of being allowed to talk at the university because of my alleged transphobia were basically weaponizing this to put me off my stride. From my perspective, I feel it's important to give a voice to women who've been subjected to male violence, regardless of their race. It's not about me, it's about wider issues. So this leads me on to the next work, which addresses inequalities in pay between male and female artists, and also the hidden mechanisms of the art world in terms of pricing, laundering, and valuations. This work was started in 2014 and is ongoing. It's called This Much I'm Worth and is a self-evaluating artwork. It's a digital artwork that continually displays its sales value. The idea from this work stemmed from the data I collected on work and values and general observations in the art world of the financial value of men's work compared to women's. Women still only command 2% of the auction market. Our work is vastly undervalued compared with men's, which means we have less resources to work with, smaller studios, and often in full-time work, so less time to practice. The work calculates the sale price using a series of complex algorithms that I call the endorsers. They use data from social media and financial markets, and they also take into account the artist's sex, race, sexuality, and other factors that affect the price. It also factors in the audience interaction via IP cameras. Realistically, no algorithm can ever accurately calculate the price of work, as this is fixed by a number of factors outside our control. Galleries, endorsements, deals with museums, and other various nefarious activities that artificially inflate and control prices. The work itself seems to question at what point does artistic merit ever enter the equation. The program was made using old and recycled equipment that I found cheap on eBay. I fabricated and programmed the work myself and collaborated with a female neon blower for the digits. Physically, I portrayed the digits like Nixie tubes used in the old calculating devices. The digits were made in neon, alluding to the sex industry where women are traded as commodities. A Korean version was commissioned by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Seoul in 2018. This is an 11-digit version used to accommodate the Korean won. It took me 3 months actually to make this work. But it took me weeks to find a female welder in Korea to make the back frame, as it was too pricey to transport. When I did, she made the most wonderful frame you can see here and turned up to the gallery with a drill in a handbag. I mean, that's why I like working with women. They're very understated. So next one. The next work is called Small Acts of Violence, which is an act of resistance disguised in visual terms by aesthetic minimalism. The language of women is censored in the same way as she's historically been excluded from the tools and skill sets of construction. In this work, I took the writings of Valerie Solanas, the Scum Manifesto, and translated it into binary. The code was then beaten using a hammer into the fabric of the building. The invisibility of the meaning of the text mirrors the way male violence perpetrated against women has been kept hidden. A small act of violence, puncturing the wall 242,740 times, celebrating small acts of resistance where strength is found in the repetition and deliberate, thoughtful process. And in 2018, I was commissioned by the Barbican Centre London to respond to the current political climate. I produced this work, American Beauty, a Trump loyal. Trump had recently come into power. I was inspired by the classic paper bag scene in the film American Beauty, which I put in the bottom right-hand corner, and I modelled the hairpiece of President Trump as it had been, and had it aimlessly blowing around the scene in a continuous loop. I felt that it poetically summed up the political direction at the time. Next one. There was an obvious wordplay on Trump loyal, translated to deceives the eye. These images have a sweet spot for viewing. This is the location that produces the best results, the perfect view. The sweet spot was once designed to provide the king and queen sitting side by side with the best experience. However, traveling in waveform, both sound and light converge at a mysterious point just behind the pair, a hidden vantage point behind the throne. Today, for the most part, governing powers adhere to structures of high capitalism orchestrated towards a single vantage point, the 1%. It's in their interest that policies are made, wars are waged, and democracies are served. When the marginalized majority begin to show signs of unrest, de facto figureheads are put forward to shift focus, frame the blame, and pretend to overturn establishments. So I naively thought that as an artist, you had the freedom to explore ideas without restriction, that were uninhibited and you could take risks that were not stalled by continuous self-censoring. I think that is still probably true for many male artists. Women have always been judged and judged more harshly by a bit different set of rules. This is my story of how I noticed things were starting to get a little weird. To contextualize, I'd actually been living remotely off-grid for 9 years preceding my cancellations, so I'd missed out on a sort of culture of, a decade of cultural shift. The next one. So I was invited to be part of a queer show in 2015. Naively, I thought queer was simply a trendy reappropriation of the gay slur, but still meant gay. going along with this, I thought I'd show some works from the 1990s where I was working alongside gay men with HIV in London. Next one. Stereotypically, the curator turned up in a pink suit, acting quite camp to collect the works. I was making some nuanced comments about the scene, the gay scene in London, that most gay people would understand, and they were received with blank looks. It transpires he had a girlfriend, and many of the other artists were straight or non-homosexuals. I was naturally curious, so I started to ask questions about what queer meant and how gay fitted in. These questions were not entirely welcomed, and I didn't really understand why. What I did, however, observe was that gay culture was being appropriated by essentially straight people, and our history assimilated to become theirs. Looking back, there were a few other instances leading up to my no platforming. In 2019, I was giving a lecture at Oxford Brookes University on my own work to students. I was contacted hours before the event to say that things were kicking off at the university because I just liked a pretty innocuous tweet about critical of gender ideology. Because of this, I apparently made the students feel unsafe. I was fairly new to this terminology, and it puzzled me why a 50-year-old woman turning up at a university by herself would make a group of students who I presume were physically robust feel unsafe. I mean, surely I was the one who should be worried. They seem to be being whipped up into some form of hysteria by the LGBTQIA++ student group after an anonymous tip-off from a Twitter account called Turfs Out of Art. As a result, the lecture was cancelled. The university put out a statement saying it was cancelled due to a booking error, a shameless lie that they got away with and stand by to this day. Within 24 hours, the national papers were reporting on how a transphobic, and that was in commas, transphobic artist was deplatformed from a university. Social media accounts from curators and people in the art world were calling me a Nazi, far-right, transphobic, and even homophobic. The next one. Following this incident, I had a major commission cancelled. No one would show my work, and I was rarely asked to speak again. My family were harassed. A director of a large arts organisation, called me one of those Germaine Greers, which I take as a compliment. A curator recently wrote to me saying she would no longer work with me as my values were out of date and the world had moved on. And this continues to this day. And you've got to remember, I just liked a tweet. There have been less than a handful of people who've supported me in the art world. They're scared that this will happen to them. I was an example. If you disagree with the orthodoxy, then this is what will happen to you. Looking back at events, I don't believe that my liking the tweet was really the problem. This issue had been weaponized to take down mainly women and strong women. Someone was waiting for me to make the wrong move. The whole process has really opened my eyes to how much actually women are hated in the art world and in general. Since then, other female artists have contacted me to share their stories that rarely get in the media, ranging from silent cancellations to being decollected by national collections. And then months after that, COVID happened and the world changed for a bit. So realizing that I wasn't going to show or have opportunities to show, I decided to find my own ways to show work. So I created MOVA, which is my van, and created the work Outrageous Algorithms, a fourth emergency service for today's problem. And this was a great success and went viral on Twitter, so then I realized you didn't really need galleries. And the van was the next recovery van, and it was really a comment on the near mythic status of algorithms and their inevitable misuse, while humorously foregrounding the controlling authors hiding behind technology to deflect blame. The misuse of data has never been more obvious as to society at large than at present moment when targeting, electioneering, vote rigging, statistical fiction, and in pandemic or examination results being tampered and made visible. So next one. Having programmed for nearly 3 decades, I don't see an algorithm being mysterious. It's not an autonomous being running riot. It's just a set of instructions and commands, like a simple recipe. The person giving the instructions should bear some responsibility for what they're being programmed to do. The last one here. No, I think one more. Okay, I'm just summing up. Since being excommunicated from the art world, I've left London and returned to my birthplace of Jersey, primarily to care for elderly parents. Jersey is a British tax haven whose very existence is based on secrets and lies. There are many similarities to the other orthodoxies out there. It's frowned upon to criticise the system, and we're told we should be grateful for the wealth it brings to the island, of course, conveniently forgetting about and ignoring the harm it does to poor countries. People who question too much are often silenced and targeted by dirty tactics. So is this sounding familiar? I feel some new work coming on. I'm sure it won't end well, but I mean, what's ours if you don't take risks? I mean, to sum up, I live and have to function in the real world. I don't think the average working person with responsibilities has the time or luxury to spend procrastinating about the minutiae of subjective truths. However, I do think the effects are spilled out into the real world, and it's having negative effects for many people. From gender ideology affecting the rights of women and girls, the lack of thinking and debate, through to the normalization of lies that surely affects people's mental well-being. I find great frustration with the art world playing dumb about what's actually happening. I think for a long time it's been corrupted. The excessive virtue signaling is painful to watch, and the lack of rigorous debate around work is frustrating. Feminists who center women in their work are not being shown. Female artists who celebrate pornography and men are being showcased. Unfortunately, this is all too predictable and very regressive. So I look forward to discussing these issues with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a really powerful presentation. We'll move on to Mariusz next. So Mariusz, who will be speaking in Polish.
For the whole of my life, I've been a person interested in literature as a commentator and then as an author. And now, recently, I've begun to work in the film industry. I had nothing to show. It's hard to show literature. However, I have a small surprise because literature sometimes also has some graphical forms. However, literatures and texts require precision of word. That's why I prefer to speak in my native tongue, in Polish. For years, I've been a journalist. And that is why I would like to present quite an ordered speech or reflection about literary postmodernism, an essay, so to say. And I would like to refer to big narratives, presence or absence and questioning of big narratives, and the current situation of the views about the world and politics and how it influenced and influences the big narratives. Let me begin with a short story. In 1967, there was a John Barth essay, The Literature of Exhaustion. This was the first text in which someone compiled and defined the most important reflections regarding postmodernism. And it was, let me repeat, 1967. The war in Vietnam was going on. The hippie revolution was appearing. It was 6 months before the famous Paris May, when this trend reached Europe, and it seemed that the world was reappearing in a way, that this consumption culture and the civilization of consumption, consumerism, reached a plateau in a way, a point of saturation, in other words. And Barth used to write, and the same refers to literature, I mean that the young generation or the middle generation felt that, as Barth wrote, some forms were exhausted and some possibilities of realistic narrative were exhausted. And he questioned in his essay fundamental ideas, notions of literature, the idea of originality. But at the same time, what I think is a big virtue of him in that essay and in his later works, he showed narrative schemes showing how it is done and he also referred to culture in his texts. He was playing with the readers, and on the basis of that, he was creating new meanings. Well, when it comes to the literary quality, you should evaluate that. I believe it was really difficult or almost impossible to read, but that's the fate of people who experiment. I'd like to say that Barth was not the first one. He just compiled what had already appeared before in literature about the crisis of the grand narratives, and a symbol of that could be the work of Jorge Luis Borges from Argentina. I think the most eminent postmodernist in history, not the most popular one. Umberto Eco, I believe, is the most popular one. However, when it comes to Borges and his intertextual texts, they are still up to date, in my opinion, and I think it's a classic, and it's nobody questions that. So I think we should add that what Barth wrote in 1967 in the Atlantic magazine was only a reference to the texts that had appeared before, because the notion of postmodernism appeared in 1959, which is 8 years before. And during these over 50 years that passed from the publishing of the text of Barth, the postmodernism has changed. And, well, it's a natural change that happens to, I think, every intellectual tendency. It used to be a very radical emerging trend, radical as regards the realizations, because the text of Barth used to be radical, but he wasn't the only one writing in such a way. Post-modernist novels were quite numerous at that time. Afterwards, and I'm speaking of my own experience, I remember times when I was a student and I was working at a university, which was the end of the 80s and the 1990s in Poland. Let me stress that, in Poland, because in the West, in America and in Western Europe, it happened before. Postmodernism dominated universities, and it became like an intellectual fashion, so to say. And more or less at that time, it was born in a way. Well, I mean, some of the symptoms appeared, the symptoms of degenerating, which happens quite frequently in radical movements. And then a pop culture version appeared in 1980s. The Name of the Rose of Umberto Eco, I think, is the best post-modernist novel, and all the novels of Umberto Eco are intertextual. Needless to say, it's a classic. I think the most important one of the second half of the 20th century of semiotics. A university professor who understood perfectly how it was done, with ready-made pieces to compose a masterpiece of literature, and it turned out to be a great success. Maybe you remember some theater plays or movies. The Name of the Rose.
Also, Umberto Eco was a very nice person, and I met him in Warsaw. He visited Warsaw once, and I even interviewed him. So he was a very charming man. He made literature out of ready-made elements, and he became an authentic star of pop culture. So postmodernism even had its pop cultural version, and then it became a less important element of the landscape of culture. Today, I have learned when I was preparing myself to this debate, it's even a topic of internet memes. There is a magazine very highly esteemed in Poland and keeping very high level, the two weekly, bi-weekly Com magazine. It published a text, Backup of Modernism. This is like laughing of modernism, joking about modernism. The author gathered some memes from the internet, some jokes, graphic jokes about postmodernism. They also reminded us of some works, some previous works, serious, let's say, works that were a critique of the postmodern method. I remember an essay by Leszek Kołakowski. It's a classic of Polish philosophy and even European philosophy. And also Zadie Smith in her book about beauty devoted entire fragments to the parody of the postmodern method. But coming back to memes, personally, I loved a meme popular among young people, young humanists who work at the universities or still study. It's a meme with Michel Foucault referring to a taxi, to the taxi driver by Michel Scorsese. Can we show it on the screen, please? No, we cannot. So I will tell you. We can see Michel Foucault's portrait. And then next to it, it's written, what the Foucault you're talking about? So you can imagine what should be instead of Foucault. I will not speak that word. I'm sure you know. It's a swear word, so I will not say it. It's a quotation from Robert De Niro, who said something similar in the Taxi Driver movie from the 1970s, where he played a taxi driver who was stalking Jodie Foster, if I'm not mistaken. So these are just jokes from the internet, so it's not that serious. But today, there are memes about everything. There is no topic that would be immune. Maybe just war. Maybe war is a topic that people don't joke about. That would be the only topic. So it's not a coincidence that young people, young humanists, because nobody else knows, so even who Michel Foucault is, they are the only ones who joke about postmodernism. Postmodernism doesn't have good press, and I think it's well deserved, because anyone who in the 80s and 90s studied in Poland can confirm what I'm going to say. And namely, texts that we used to read by Derrida, by Baudrillard, the main philosophical postmodernists in class. We used to read that in philosophy class, in sociology class. They are so manneristic. They are messy, intellectually messy. I think they are completely non-transparent, non-structured. The narrative is completely confusing. And even if you read it with attention, there is no way of understanding what they meant. So even in books or movies that are done in the postmodern style, they are difficult to understand, but philosophical essays should make sense, I'd say, but they don't. But this lack of understanding, the ability to understand, might lead to interesting conclusions. So I'd be convinced that Baudrillard was not mistaken several times when he created the theory of the simulacra. He was right. Simulacra exist. Simulacrum can be seen on TV, not only on TV, also on the internet. But how Baudrillard wrote, and his texts are also difficult to read, difficult to understand, but Derrida is much worse in this respect. So it's very hard to understand. literary texts, we can speak about Thomas Pynchon, who is a good example, an icon of literary postmodernism. But, well, of course, there are even legend about how hard he is to understand. Of course, he has his fans, and quite many in Poland as well. I have seen good reviews of his books, and okay, he can write. I don't. I can admit that, but his books with the Gravity, Rainbow, and so on and so forth will not be a mainstream of literature. It will be just a footnote for literature. It will not enter the mainstream because it's so hard to understand. And even James Joyce in Ulysses, he wrote a book that was difficult to understand as well, but definitely he proposed something new, a new literary method, which we cannot say about Pynchon. But in spite of what I said earlier, I would not criticize that much what postmodernists wrote. Maybe Pynchon, Barth, or Donald Barthelme, or Italo Calvino didn't create masterpieces. Not even Umberto Eco, perhaps, created a masterpiece. Borges did create masterpieces, but I wouldn't call Borges a postmodernist writer. I think he was a precursor, a pioneer of postmodernism, ahead of his time. But those who came later used that legacy very well, drawing from those writers. Without postmodernism, I couldn't imagine the magical realism of Cortázar and Marquez. We would not have Julian Barnes, who is one of the best, most eminent British writers nowadays, I would say. And Salman Rushdie would be another one that could be compared with Barthes. And we wouldn't have very charming books by Umberto Eco and other authors who copied Umberto Eco. And there wouldn't be a Nobel Prize for Olga Tokarczuk in literature, Polish writer, who also draws inspiration from postmodernism. And another interesting thing in this context is that we wouldn't have a new generation of new American novels, such as Franzen, Don DeLillo, and Cormac McCarthy. It seems, when we look at their books, is that postmodernism saved the great realistic novel because it gave it new energy. It's impossible to write in a naive way as authors used to write in the 19th century or at the beginning of the 20th century, such as Charles Dickens or Balzac or other American classics from those times, such as Mark Twain. But we are surrounded by so many narratives that this literary postmodernism has taught contemporary writers to be ironic. It gave them tools to use some well-known narrative schemes in a new, fresh way, and on that basis create something new. So thanks to that, I think that in the world of Baudrillard's simulacrums, those books can be read without the feeling that it's an archaic literature or that the method is comical. And by the way, we have an entire industry, because we can call it an industry, I think that's the most proper name for it, of literature that is being produced in the style of the 19th century. And I'm speaking of genre literature, because genre literature is based on very archaic patterns. But at the same time, it also makes use the phraseology, or at the level of narrative tricks or twists. It does use some contributions from postmodernism. Although Umberto Eco used the legacy of Baudrillard and Derrida in his own texts, those action book, action novel writers don't use that legacy as much. They might use the legacy of Umberto Eco. And when we compare Barthes with Lychard, we have similar literary patterns. But that was just a digression. And it's also worth mentioning that contemporary cinema and its high quality draws a lot from postmodernism as well. The main representatives, cinema is slightly different from literature because the most well-known postmodern creators like David Lynch, Greenaway, and Pedro Almodovar, I would even venture saying, they do have masterpieces. But without their experiments, the formal and narrative experiments they did, we would not have interesting cinema today. The most interesting elements of contemporary cinema, like Quentin Tarantino is difficult to categorize, to label. And the same happens with Christopher Nolan, with Memento or Inception movies. Even speaking of Matrix by the Wachowski brothers, without postmodernism, those movies wouldn't exist. Nobody would create this kind of narrative. Nobody would come up with this idea to build a narrative in the cinema in this way. So there is a question now, like we have with any intellectual movement that got degenerated. Postmodernism started so well and achieved so much. Why did it end so badly? I would refer to answer this question, I would refer to an example from Poland. In our literature, in postmodernism, during the times of communism, some classics, there were two eminent writers, Jerzy Andrzejewski and Teodor Parnicki. It's very characteristic. During the times of communism, we were fighting for freedom. So the books by those authors, the postmodern authors who had this postmodern spirit, they deconstructed great narrative as such. They were forgotten by readers. Andrzejewski is known for other books, the classical novels he wrote about such topics like the destiny of Polish people of those times, with Ash and Diamond, which is a lie because it compared the communists with the soldiers fighting partisans fighting for independence. So some people thought that those were at the same level and we could choose between those two things, but it's just a digression. Later, postmodernism was reborn after 1989, because in Poland it was a moment of transition. It seemed that we could finally write what we wanted, that there would not be a taboo topic or a crucial topic. We didn't have to write about freedom, about individuals, about independence. And some writers after 1989 did follow the steps of postmodernism, Zita Rudzka, Marek Bieńczyk, but very quickly that fire was extinguished. Why? It looks that sociology and social psychology can answer this question, social sciences in general. In the West, postmodernism appeared when the consumerism was flourishing in the society. Everybody got rich, everybody got everything. It was a triumph of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy led us to a moment of the end of history. Just like wrote Francis Fukuyama wrote this. In Poland, it happened, we can say, in 1989. But we all know, after 30 years, that it didn't last long. 12 years later, on September 11th, reopened history again. And as a result of September 11, there was the global war against terrorism. Then we had the pandemic in parallel because the war against terrorism is still going on. Then Vladimir Putin entered on the stage by taking tanks to Ukraine. And it turns out that history has not finished yet, and it has a new face. There are some divisions that we know from the Cold War that happened almost a half a century ago. We can see the same distinction with new quality in the 21st century. And now we can ask about postmodernism, such topics like the war in Ukraine or the September 11. Can they be described with the language of postmodernism? Nobody has tried to write about Ukraine in this way, but Thomas Pynchon tried to write in this style about September 11. I think this was his biggest failure, artistic failure, because when you read that book in the network, so he described what was happening before September 11 and after, and it reads as a text by a paranoid person with theories about deep network, who was responsible about links between international terrorists, while what people need in times of crisis, such as the war or terrorist attack, is different. People expect something else. People expect catharsis, and this is the essence of literature. And postmodern narratives do not give us a possibility of catharsis. Therefore, in times where history keeps going, postmodernism in art is not necessary for anything anymore, or not useful anymore. It was a narrative of the end of history, but history has not finished. History is going on very quickly and developing very dynamically. So we can say that the historical role of postmodernism is done, is finished. Although the legacy of postmodernism is not all bad, not negative as such. A new generation of writers will deal with the topic of the war in Ukraine, will take some tools and achievements from postmodernism, and they will write in a better way, more convincing way for the contemporary reader. Although their prose will no longer be postmodern. So thinking about the answer to the question whether postmodernism was good or bad, because we should talk in the past tense already, this epoch, this era has ended or is ending. So I think the answer would be that postmodernism is no longer useful. And that's all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. It was great to hear your presentation there. We'll move on to Esme, and then we will open out for conversation. So, Esme, over to you.
Hello, thank you both for those really interesting and quite unique in their own right presentations. Can I just check that the PowerPoint is up on the YouTube, not the screen? Okay, great. There may be some delay, so just please bear with me. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of delay. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. I can't hear you, so we'll have to go. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback, but I'll just ignore it. I want to talk about postmodernism from a kind of spiritual perspective, sociological perspective, but I think in order to do that, it's important to understand what modernity is, because postmodernity is firstly and foremostly a reaction against or response to modernity. So it helps to define that. So if I could have the next slide, please. Perfect. So what is modernity then? So modernity tends to be associated with the European Enlightenment, So 17th, 18th centuries primarily. And this is a time which is in many ways characterized by a will or a desire to overcome all the perceived ignorance and superstition of the church primarily, but also political authorities. A kind of intense period of skepticism towards all kinds of authority, really, in the hopes that if you do away with all of these restrictive political and religious systems, we can really know the truth. So it's really a spirit of daring to know. And of course, these were Immanuel Kant's words in his famous treatise, What is Enlightenment, which is something that the postmodernists later respond to. So it's all about daring to know. It's all about human ambition, trying to overcome the restrictions of antiquity, of the past, of the church, of all of these supposedly anti-rational institutions. But this ultimately leads to the triumph of these grand narratives, which Lyotard is the term that he is associated with that term. And these grand narratives are really where you have philosophers such as Kant and also Descartes coming up with theories about the world, human existence, I think the place of human beings in the world, which lead to almost quite kind of sort of totalitarian narratives, basically about what it means to be a human being and progress, and what it means to progress forwards. And so for this reason, there's been a lot of criticism of the Enlightenment because it forges these grand narratives based on very human desires and worldly power in a way. And Rajani Kant, who wrote a really excellent book called Against Eurocentrism, which is kind of the most biting criticism of the Enlightenment I think I've ever read, other than maybe Rene Guénon or a few others. But he calls the Enlightenment a period of anthropocentric vanity. And the word anthropocentric, I think, sums it up quite well, because it's this idea that man is placed at the center of the universe, and man is overcoming all barriers, including nature itself. You may be familiar with Francis Bacon, who's a kind of archetypal Enlightenment philosopher, who comes up with the notion of dominating nature. I mean, actually, it comes from Descartes, but in Francis Bacon particularly, there's this idea that human beings are really we're kind of the center of the universe, and we have to modify and control everything, basically. So this is where the postmodern critique comes out of, really. So you have Foucault, who's already been mentioned a couple of times, and rightfully so, really key thinker in postmodernism. He accuses Western modernity of being this kind of anthropocentric, not just human-centered, but sort of Western male. All the I'm sure these are very well-known critiques, but sees it as being a kind of imposition of these kind of grand narratives coming out of the West onto the world. And we can have the next slide, please. So these grand narratives lead to the rationalization and secularization of human societies, and what a sociologist called Daniel Bell has called the great profanation, which is basically where, because man has decided that he is going to understand and thereby control the natural world, it kind of does away with the sort of mysteries of the unknown. Beyond the human-centric viewpoint. I think most famously this has been described as disenchantment. It's a world that's basically abandoned transcendence, or rather put transcendence in a place that's so far away from human endeavors that we sort of cease to think about it. And what that leads to is a fully materialist, a rationalist, a march of progress, or rather infinite march of progress. So all of this is really what characterizes modernity. And modernity, in this sense, is really quite antithetical to the human spirit, which wants to contemplate higher realities. It wants a sense of mystery. And I think this early feeling of disenchantment is very beautifully captured in the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold, whose poem Dover Beach, describes the experience of standing on what he called the darkling plain, where he's watching a sea of faith ebbing to the distance. It's retreating, and then all that's left is this darkling plain, which I think covers it really nicely. Of course, this disenchantment, which Matthew Arnold is describing in 1850 something, unfortunately gets a whole lot worse because, you go from having Victorian factories like the one in the image, which is a certain representation of modernity, but that becomes intensified with globalization and Henry Ford and what's known as Fordism. So the kind of capitalism of mass production and this mass homogenizing effect on the world, basically. So if we go to the next slide, I talk a bit about the one before, the reaction to that. So in the 20th century, against grand narratives, yeah. So in the 20th century, you start to see a reaction to these grand narratives, and that is not just industrial modernity, but it's also, it's communism, fascism, liberalism, nationalism, even. It's all these grand structures, arguably kind of artificially imposed on the world, and they're becoming very totalizing. And so postmodernism, early postmodernism, before it's even called postmodernism, really, emerges in reaction to this. And I think the best example is Adorno and Horkheimer's work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is written in the late 1940s. And they are criticizing the rationalizing and dehumanizing nature of enlightened modernity, and they see it as a bourgeois imposition. They see this Western modernity as being this very bourgeois thing. And there's quite a great quote here, which really captures Adorno and Horkheimer's use of language, which is at times very verbose, but nonetheless entertaining, where they talk about the affinity between knowledge and planning, which has set its stamp of inescapable functionality on a bourgeois existence, rationalized even in its breathing spaces. The special architectonic structure of the Kantian system, like the gymnast pyramids in Saturday's orgies, and the formalized principles of early bourgeois Freemasonry prefigures the organization devoid of any substantial goals, which was to encompass the whole of life. So you've got this idea that Western modernity has imposed these structures, these artificial structures on modernity, which are bourgeois, they are restrictive, they don't allow us to really be ourselves, live our best lives. There's no real purpose to them. It's all a kind of artificial thing. And so they, in my opinion, quite rightly get a reaction against that. So turn to the next slide. Just a few notes on Foucault. Foucault, yeah, Against Truth. Which is a slightly provocative title, admittedly. So post-structuralists like Foucault, they try to deconstruct these grand narratives of the Enlightenment. They say, much like Adorno and Horkheimer, that this is really an artificial order of things, and it's not representative of reality. So where this critique goes wrong, in my opinion, is that it doesn't really offer an alternative. And actually what it does is it just further breaks down what reality. It further denies any sense of a kind of reality beyond human constructs. It basically denies truth. I think sometimes, there is a danger of scapegoating Foucault a bit or kind of exaggerating. But, he says in his own words, truth is a thing of this world. It's something which is fabricated. And that applies not only to the truth of the Enlightenment, but all truths at all different times and places, including religion. So Foucault, I won't read this entire quote as I don't want to go too much over time, but he basically says in the end of this quote on the screen that when we try to imply that there is a kind of global or trans-historical, trans-cultural set of values or an image of reality that can apply to everyone, and he actually describes that as being dangerous. And by that, he's quite possibly referring to fascism, which is basically the kind of extreme of Enlightenment modernity, because it's not only asserting that there is a fixed order of things, but that every single person has to follow it in the same way. And so you can kind of see why Foucault is saying this, but as I say, the problem with it is that instead of critiquing the grand narratives of modernity, but saying there is a kind of absolute truth, but it's not what these people are claiming it to be. It's something greater than the Enlightenment. Instead of having the humility to kind of see that, he just says, no, there's no truth at all. It's all just a spectacle, and it's dangerous to claim otherwise. So moving on to the next slide. What you basically get from this is relativism, because it's the view that if there's no objective truth that holds everything together, then basically everyone is just forging truths which aren't reflective of any objective reality. Ernest Gellner wrote a very good book on postmodernism in the 90s, where he very succinctly defines it as the basic material of text, societies, and almost anything is meaning, so just kind of human projections or ideologies, really, rather than anything real. That means are there to be decoded or deconstructed, and then that the notion of objective reality is suspect. So you can quite easily see this direct link between postmodernism and relativism. Since postmodernism denies that there's any objective truth uniting all individuals and cultures together, it basically leads to the view that beliefs and perspectives are just social constructs. And Nietzsche anticipates this pretty well, I think, when he says that there are various I's, and as a result, there are various truths, and as a result, there is no truth. So it's just there's plurality, it must be relative, so there's actually nothing objectively real at all. So next slide, please. So this is associated with a very long word, which is the subject of a book edited by Paul Helas and others, called detraditionalization. And it's a great word because it kind of single-handedly sums up what happens when you live in a world where nobody really takes seriously the truth claims of particular cultures, because they believe that they're really just inventions of those cultures. So detraditionalization has been expressed through this notion which Paul Helas describes, which is where multivocal culture, it serves to confuse. Differentiation serves to undermine the exclusivistic claims and credibility of what was previously homogenous and therefore unquestioned. So it's this encounter with the other that makes people doubt what they believe is actually true. Zygmunt Bauman is probably one of the best writers on postmodernity, although he doesn't call it postmodernity, he calls it liquid modernity, which is basically where you live in a reality where nothing is really held together. Societies don't uphold values, even religious institutions are kind of doubting themselves. I mean, I hate to say it, but you do see that in England, the Church of England, there is almost a kind of self-doubt in almost every institution in this country, religious or political. And it's because there's no confidence in what we believe is actually true. And so he describes a postmodern city as being one where traffic is daily rerouted and street names are liable to be changed without notice. There's just no continuity. Everything is just flux, and everything is just relative. And right at the beginning, there was a mention of capitalism and the relationship between postmodernism and capitalism. And I would actually say that it's a relationship which is very mutually beneficial, because if you create a society where people don't have a strong sense of shared truth, which is rooted in community, you just have my truth, my personal individual truth, and that's the ideal condition for consumerist self-actualization, because everybody becomes obsessed with building their brand and having their own very, very unique kind of identity and set of values, and so it goes hand in hand, and I think the kind of disintegration of tradition, likewise, is also very, very readily co-opted by a capitalist society. But maybe that's something to discuss at the end. So in my opinion, this really just leads to nihilism. Having grown up in a society which is thoroughly detraditionalized, I think other than singing a couple of vaguely Christian theme songs in my school assemblies, there was no real cultural or religious fabric holding people together. And I think that really just does lead to nihilism, because nobody has any faith in anything. So on to my penultimate slide. Is postmodernism good or bad? That's what we're here to discuss. So I think that the impulse that postmodernism is coming out of, I think, is a very healthy one. I think modernity did impose artificial and actually dangerous narratives of science, progress, and reason, which were completely out of touch with human nature. The problem with postmodernism is that it's just as disenchanting as modernity because it doesn't return to any kind of superhuman truth. It just denies that even that kind of truth is real or meaningful. And so, you know, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to wanting to, you know, deconstruct the narratives of modernity, but you have to see that they are actually obscuring an ultimate truth, a transcendent truth. And the problem with postmodernity is that it doesn't do that at all. It just says, oh, well, everything is fake. And so, yeah, just to kind of summarize that process, the way I see it, it's like, you know, one, enlightenment modernity replaces those transcendent truths with these human constructs, rationality, etc. Postmodernism rightly criticizes them, claiming that they're not the truth. But then, as I say, instead of actually returning to a kind of pre-modern idea of truth, so by that I mean the teachings contained within religion or even the Platonic ideals, these ideas of truth which are actually beyond the human senses and beyond human perception. It just says that they're a thing of this world. Those are, you know, Foucault's own words, and therefore we just have to deconstruct everything. And so we're left with only debris, basically. So, in my opinion, postmodernism is bad because it's actually just a continuation of Enlightenment modernity, which takes us even further away from any idea of eternal truth. To go back to Matthew Arnold, this idea of sweetness and light, and you get sweetness and light when you look to eternal truth. When you look beyond the, you know, the steel and iron and coal of modernity, and you actually see something higher and better. So to my final slide, which I think addresses how I see things from a more kind of spiritual perspective, I suppose. In a postmodern world where everything is just debris, it's just leftovers of ideologies that have been partly demolished and sort of, you know, it's all a kind of mess, as Zygmunt Bauman describes. We're really living in what Plato sort of described as a kind of a cave full of shadows. We're just completely in the dark. Everything's ephemeral and ever changing, and we are kind of hindered from actually looking at anything higher. And I think this image of shifting shadows is deeply related to Plato, but it's also biblical. And I think a very moving passage and from the Bible is that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. So this idea that human beings, we need to have our eyes on something permanent, on something that is eternal, and therefore to be guided by some kind of certainty, and certainties which are really, in a paradoxical way, kind of beyond human knowledge. And without these, in my opinion, I think we just remain submerged in these shadows of uncertainty, and therefore we're just as disenchanted as before. And so, in this sense, as I say, postmodernity hasn't really offered us an alternative to Enlightenment modernity. It's just demolished it, so all we're left with debris, and we're just in this world of chaos and shadow, and ultimately darkness. So that is a slightly sad note to end on, but I'd be delighted to have a discussion about all these ideas and how they relate to art as well.
Great, thank you so much, Esme. And please give a round of applause to all of our speakers. That's so much food for thought. My mind is buzzing right now. So we'll kind of have a conversation here, and then we'll open out to questions or thoughts from the audience. Is that okay? I think the common threads that's coming in is about this sort of question of meaning and questioning truth, that there is no truth, there is no one truth. So whether in the form of religion, where obviously the truth is very important in the sphere of Christianity or even other religions, and in the lived experience of someone like you, Rachel, where, you know, what is a woman is being called into question, you know, and suddenly where we all kind of knew what a woman was, we no longer do know what a woman is. And so that kind of lived reality, and if you kind of assert some objective reality on that, there is kickback. And then parody, you know, which is obviously a very kind of strong feature in pop culture, in art, I would say South Park, adding on to popular culture, is probably one of the great postmodernist pieces of animation that we have, and it does poke fun at authority. And I think, in defense of what I would say the good things of postmodernism, is how it does question authority, how it does ask you to dig deeper in search of meaning. Perhaps there may not be any kind of final truth, but there's a contesting. Truth is contested within a postmodern kind of thought or culture that we live in. And then Marius, I think, gave a fantastic survey of postmodern literature. And have we come to the end of the postmodern literary form or genre? And going back to history, and particularly with regards to 9/11 and what's going on with the Russian aggression and invasion of Ukraine. Some of the great novels have been historical novels. You know, we can sort of see that with, you know, from Tolstoy to even more recently the recently departed Hilary Mantel. You know, with her novels, and they are actually more popular than you know, Thomas Pynchon or William Burroughs or something. You know, they are great works of contemporary literature, and most people will relate to Hilary Mantel compared to Thomas Pynchon, for example. So that's really fascinating to hear. I think we got some really interesting things, because obviously with regards to religion, you know, is that a metaphysical thing? Is that truth, or is that a construct? You know, there's a kind of interesting thoughts. We, in spirituality, we are seeing this kind of very strong hybridization between technology and kind of DIY spiritualism, which I know Esme's written a lot about, through, you know, kind of TikTok shamanism and so forth, or Instagram witch talk, you know, things like that. So technology is a very strong feature, I think, within postmodernity and the postmodern life. That obviously as a kind of post-war thing, where the rise of the mass media, the rise of various other kind of forms of telecommunications, which now is so strong, which Marius, I think, pointed out very clearly. You know, meme culture, is that the new postmodern art form of our times? We're all talking about memes. It's children and young people are kind of creating memes. Donald Trump creates memes. You know, there's a wonderful book that I saw in the Tate Modern Bookshop of Donald Trump's tweets, you know, which are kind of now recontextualized as kind of almost like haiku poetry, you know, and that's quite interesting, you know, sort of the wisdom of Donald Trump, you know, through poetry and through his tweets. So I think we're kind of, postmodernism probably is not over yet, that's my thought. But we are still living it. So let's open all these kind of ideas out for discussion. Where would you like to start? Agnieszka.
Actually, question really to all of us here, to also look at an element where I'm wondering whether with postmodernity in culture and then that seeping into everyday life, if we also got disconnected from our bodies and the physical experience of the world, and how that then plays out in together with the losing the tradition and beliefs systems, disconnects people from the deeper connections with other people, with the whole, with communities, then with the whole society. And then with multiplication of different channels of engagement that we are kind of enticed to join in, because it's not just TV that you would watch for an hour a day or something, but then you don't talk to the people on the bus anymore because you're sitting in your phone. And then it deepens and deepens, and then it's talked about in Britain and in the Western world, the mental health crisis. And then again, we are not being encouraged and open towards, again, going back into our bodies and connecting with other people on a deeper level. No, we are encouraged to take medication. we are encouraged to use an app for meditation, and this is the way for you to connect with the world and with others, and apparently it's supposed to heal you. So I'm wondering about that, whether there is any connection between postmodernity being on hyper steroids now, completely not just deconstructing the novels we read, the art we look at, but actually deconstructing our own lives and our own connection to our physical bodies and other people's bodies, and what animates them, what motivates them to eat and breathe and actually exist in the society. And I think that also in my thinking, when I was making my notes, it linked with erosion of human dignity. Only recently, Shanti de Corte, who survived the terror attack in Belgium, she was assisted in killing herself because she couldn't deal with her depression post the terror attack. And she was listed with the other victims of the bombing at the airport in Brussels as a victim. And I'm wondering what kind of a society we live in that this is the conclusion someone comes up to when they miraculously survive the terror attack. So I'm quite curious, what do you think?
Yeah, very good points.
We have to distinguish between two things. The postmodern world is chaotic. The notions are chaotic. So I loved what Esme said. It was a great presentation about the postmodern times, while what I said and what Rachel said was more about postmodern art. So when we speak about postmodern art, we may say that in literature, in the cinema, there are some tropes, some motives that still survive, and it still survives in modern art, as we have heard. I think that is due to the fact that our world, well, this work was a great commentary. The work with the price of the artwork, was a great commentary to our world that is devoid of rules. And the rules are given by curators and not the viewers, not the audience. So I think that postmodernism is still well and kicking in the modern art world, but nobody will buy a postmodern novel anymore because it will be tiring, and nobody will watch a postmodern movie because it will be irritating for the viewers. So when we speak about postmodern art, I would say so-so. In literature, it doesn't thrive, while it does thrive better in contemporary art. So what Rachel said was great in this respect. When I was listening to Agnieszka, Rachel, and Esme, I was taking notes in my phone because I don't even have a pen to take notes on paper. So let's move on to the second meaning of because if we want to get some order in the notions, we live in postmodern world. There is no doubt about it. What Esme said was a great way to organize it and in a systemic way. So there are two questions. When we speak of grand narratives, the peak achievement, maybe that's not a good way to put it, the peak expression of postmodernism, the grand ideologies like communism and fascism, we can see what it brought us to. It was from enlightenment, so the triumph of reason was transferred into the triumph of force, whose objective was extermination, and this is something awful, horrible. I can think of two reasons of that, two causes. First of all, both of those causes were described very well by Czesław Miłosz. He focused especially on one of them and a bit less on the second one in his Ulroland essay, one of the earliest from the 60s and 70s. It was the earliest analysis, very well thought of, about the end of modernism and beginning of postmodernism. Miłosz tried to prove in his book that the key to understand today's world is to understand the basic truth. In a world without sacrum, there is a triumph of reason, but the triumph of reason ends with lack of reason and killing people, and a massacre. Because we are devoid of a value system that would be objectively operating and respected by everyone. Even if in the past we used to have massacres and wars, they were not, let's say, planned. They were not like Holocaust. Reason did not plan the massacres. It was caused by anger, while in the grand narratives, like Esme told us, ideological narratives, extermination is planned by reason. So it must have ended this way. It must have been questioned in the end. So this is how postmodernism was born. But what happens in this postmodernism? If we destroyed one kind of world, the sacrum was disappeared. And then domination of technology. Me taking notes in the phone, that's not too significant, but we have so much technology in the world today that people cannot live without technology anymore. It feels that in our deepest, even in the deepest interior of Africa, I know from experience, they have smartphones. They don't have roads, they have no sewerage system, but they do have smartphones, and they live inside of those smartphones, of course, if they can afford it, and they live on the internet. So they jumped directly from, let's say, primal culture to the technical civilization, skipping everything in between. So those two factors, when they clash against each other, the fall of religion, that is the destruction of sacrum, the end of modernism, triumph of technology, brings us into postmodernism, times when we believe in things that are fake. So Zygmunt Bauman, although I don't agree with him, or Jacques Derrida, or Michel Foucault, they are not guilty for describing it or diagnosing it. Even those who were inspired by communism and Marxism, Adorno and Horkheimer, who are mentioned in the presentation, they were looking for a different path. They had no other thing to do. They had to search for a different path, but the Western world did not find an alternative path. And we are in this point right now. So this is why shamanism appears on TikTok, like Manik mentioned. And this is why we have trouble communicating between each other. This is why we question gender, and we question objective truth and objective facts. We live in a world, Baudrillard was right, is so fake that simulacrums are everywhere. But we cannot blame postmodern philosophers. This is simply what the world is right now. This is a postmodern world, which is horrible, but humanity deserves it, let's say, because we worked for it. Thank you.
Rachel, any thoughts on what's been discussed, or the thoughts that have been expressed?
Yes, just a few. My brain is absolutely fried. They were so different, all three talks. No, just a few things which I was noting down about smartphones. I mean, this is the sort of link, in a sense, to capitalism. I mean, even in the slums in India, it's one family has a smartphone. I mean, and that's just for pushing sales and stuff like that. I mean, that's for the capitalism, I guess, in a sense, there's a reason behind that. Another thought, do normal people go around questioning absolute truths, or is it just academics? You know, I mean, academic discourse. I mean, sometimes I'll question how helpful it is. I mean, the average person isn't going around sort of questioning, I mean, say, just take an example like gender. You know what I mean? And we know all this problem came from postmodern or from academic discourse, and I'm quite interested how it's just affected, say, the normal people. I don't know whether that's the right word in the world. Yes, how helpful that is at all. And what else was I going on about? Do you want to say that? Or yes.
Because when we were questioning whether, you know, like everyday person out in the street would question the reality, absolute truth, and then man and a woman, they might not question it, but their child will come back from school and say, I have a different name, and actually I'm on the blockers, hormonal blockers, and that's it, deal with it. And in a sense, it's not even that they question it, it hits them in the face.
Yes. Yes, that's very true. I mean,
That's true.
That is very true. What I was going to say, I get what Esma said about offering no alternatives, I mean, which is completely true. I mean, I think deconstructing the grand narratives is necessary, but I mean, we're ripping them apart without even knowing, I don't even know why, without any alternatives. I think of the analogy when I was young, and I used to go around with a screwdriver and take my mother's washing machine apart. I used to go around the house taking everything apart. And, you know, the collateral damage was you'd have these machines that didn't even work. I had no idea how to put them back together again. And I sort of see postmodernism a bit like that. It's quite destructive. I'm being quite simplistic here, but that's kind of how I think.
Okay, Esme, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, I think it's an important question, Rachel, you asked, you know, do normal people think about absolute truth? Is it something that really crosses the minds of people? And I think, you know, the answer to that is, well, you know, maybe not. But it's still the case that all of society, in my opinion, suffers if we don't think about absolute truth. Like, even if individuals aren't interested in it, like, you know, not everybody will be, but I think, like, going back to the example you just gave, you know, as soon as people start to lose faith in, you know, even the most basic acts of visible reality, then that does affect everyone. And I think it also just, you know, I mean, it's reflected in the statistics of, you know, particularly young people and mental health. I think I just saw today, actually, in the news that antidepressant usage in the UK has gone up, I think it was 22% or 20-something percent since 2015. And I mean, you know, sure, that's not to discredit. There are many far more kind of concrete reasons for that. I mean, especially cost of living crisis. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that that's a primary cause for why the quality of mental health has deteriorated. But I think there is also something to be said for the fact that people don't really put their faith in things anymore, because there's always a kind of suspicion as to whether anything really matters. And so we live in this kind of world of flux, that postmodern city that Zygmunt Bauman is describing, where, you know, even communities are just so fluid. And I think, going back to the internet question, people don't really have communities, partly because everything is so disembodied now. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, I've made some amazing connections online, and through doing things like this, this also maybe because I am silly and lost my passport, but you know, even so, like in other contexts, you know, you do meet people online. There is lots to be said for kind of digital communities, but the reality is that it is embodied. So if we have an existence which is entirely based on virtual rather than tangible connections, you just start to lose a sense of meaning. I mean, this all sounds kind of obvious, I suppose, and I'm, you know, certainly not the first person to make these critiques. But for me, it's just staggering, sort of like, everybody knows we're in this situation, so why isn't anybody doing, you know, why, you know, I feel like we all realize that we all suffer from lack of community, and it seems so obvious, and yet it's not really addressed. And I do think part of the problem is that the left, the current left, kind of temporary left, whatever you want to call it, I think most people would agree that whatever the left is now is quite distant from what it was at one point. It seems in many ways that they actually embrace this kind of ultra postmodern kind of consumer society which thrives off of disembodiment and people not having traditions and not having communities. So it's kind of strange to me that they seem quite comfortable with that in a strange way, even though it's quite clearly been co-opted by capitalism and is clearly making things, exploiting us in different ways. So yeah, that's my sort of slightly sprawling thoughts on all of those issues.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open it out to the audience if there's any of you with thoughts or questions to our esteemed panel. We have about 20 minutes, so please don't feel shy. Ask questions and fire away. Any thoughts? Okay, well, we'll continue the discussion. Do stick your hands up if, and we'll go straight to you. If we have got a question. Let me pass the microphone to you. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for all of this. It was really amazing to hear you all. I was wondering how it all stands against not Western world, because we mentioned phones being in India, being in Africa, but we don't consider how they are living and how they still have the traditions in Asia being quite strong. And well, that's my question.
That'd be a very good question to ask you. That, you know, obviously beyond the Western world, you know, the capitalist West, religion is still very strong in Asia, in Africa, in South America, for example, despite the smartphone. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose it's because in those societies, technology isn't quite as all-pervasive in the way that it is here, and I think there is still that healthy separation between what you're kind of viewing on your phone in the evenings and what, you know, something you kind of intentionally switch onto, versus where we are currently in the modern West, where technology is literally in every single part of our lives, to an extent where technology may even become, you know, part of us. I mean, I'm not sure how seriously one should take all these kinds of things about like microchips or whatever. It all gets slightly conspiratorial, but there is a lack of division between the real world and the virtual world in the modern West, which I think it hasn't quite got to that stage in other cultures. I suppose the other possibility is that, you know, even in countries where religion is still quite a strong force, even technology can kind of influence and distort what a religious community organically feels like or is. I feel like, you know, it could be, you know, I speak, you know, things like kind of Islamic modernism or Islamic postmodernism. I mean, it's hard to imagine, right? But, you know, it's not impossible. I think the influence of these things is so all-pervasive, or it can be. That sort of answers a little bit.
Okay, thanks. And any questions or thoughts on responding to?
I just wanted to joke back to Esme that Islamic postmodernism wouldn't be possible because they would be all dead. It's not allowed to deconstruct Muhammad's words.
Obviously, as we saw with the satanic verses, yeah, which I think is a great postmodern novel,
yeah,
actually.
I mean, no, that's very true. I mean, actually, it's going back to Ernest Gellner, who I quoted earlier. In his book on postmodernism, he actually does portray Islam as being the antithesis of postmodernity, and the book is kind of framed in that, through that axis, I suppose. So yes, perhaps that was not accurate.
Mariusz, you wanted to respond.
I would like to say that the key issue when it comes to post-modernism, it's not only a question of religion, but also the question of affluence in the financial way. The postmodern world is a Western world because here in the West, in the so-called civilized West, consumerism was born. And this consumption societies or communities in other cultures are quite different from ours. So they face different problems with themselves. I'm not an expert in that. However, well, we mentioned grand narratives that turned into totalitarianism. But it happened here, not there. So if the Chinese adopted communism, they took them from the Russians, and the Russians took communism from Marx. So it's not a coincidence that these most technological societies that are so far away from spirituality and refusing the religion, eliminating religion from their lives, now are facing the biggest problems with themselves. And it seems that in Asia and Africa, maybe not everywhere, the problems are yet to appear. Because I think that, for example, China, in some time, they will experience something like this, because they're tradition in China, it doesn't have this religious roots. They have certain way of life, philosophy on life, Confucius based philosophy. I think that the financial status of the whole society is a key factor. If we talk about societies different than what we call the West, well, we can see some rich elites, but the average purchasing power is quite low. And there are big differences when it comes to wealth. So this is my just observation as a like. I'm not an expert of that societies. I used to live in Japan and in Myanmar. I came back in 2020 to Poland, and especially in Myanmar or Burma, I could experience big transitions, because in 2015, a democratic party of Aung San Suu Kyi took power and held that power until February of 2021, if I remember correctly, when there was a military coup d'etat. And I used to live there, and I could observe the society and the reactions of the society. So I could see that there was a group of very rich people, let's say the wealthiest owners of companies, the ones that were exploiting the natural resources of the country. But the rest, the vast majority of society, they live in a very traditional way. And even these very wealthy people, they are Buddhists and they're practitioners, because Buddhism is the dominating religion in Myanmar. And even if they drive Ferraris or very expensive cars, even if you drive a Ferrari, every morning you go to a Buddhist temple. So that was a very interesting experience to be able to observe that. So the modernism was affecting the poor people, because, for example, they got a job in a factory, but they needed to approach the factory to travel by very low quality buses. They were breathing smog and very polluted air on the way. And another thought Mariusz said about this transition from traditional life to modern life. I was in Putao in the north of Myanmar, and I had just a normal compact Panasonic camera. I was taking photos of children participating in a Christian mission, and they just didn't know, those children didn't know what a camera was what taking picture was. Some of them had smartphones, taking pictures with smartphones, but they were looking at this device, at this strange thing. That was the the jump from the very traditional era to the postmodernism era. So the classical cameras were simply unknown to them. So smartphones on one hand, but on the other hand, tradition Buddhism. However, I think that tradition is kind of fading or dying there, and I could see the beginnings of this process of let's say the tradition becoming less and less strong. So, well, anyway, it was very interesting to observe. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any more thoughts from the audience? I think that's really interesting about tradition and postmodernism. Very great contribution, so thank you for that. Any other thoughts, questions? We'll move back to our panel if so, but again, just quickly stick your hands up and we'll get back to you. I think this, obviously postmodernism is so rich. We're talking about tradition, talking about culture, talking about different kind of cultural contexts. And I suppose the kind of bottom question, which I think we're all touching on, is about this atomization, this sense that we are, I suppose it is a sense of kind of postmodern alienation to community, to a sense of the real world, to just thinking about what you said, Rachel, that maybe the wider middle are rolling their eyes up about this whole thing, and it's only artists and academics that might be pontificating on the search for meaning, or is there is no meaning. But then, at the same time, if we're looking at the language, and language is what's always called into question in postmodernist thinking, that there is no fixed definition. Language is not a window onto meaning. So I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on that. And that's where things like a woman is called into question, for example. That becomes that word doesn't tie in with the real individual subject. Subject. So those kind of thoughts, that's where it comes in the everyday. We're using, preferred gender pronouns on our signatures in the office, at work, on dating apps even, so, you'll see someone that's quite clearly,
really
someone that's quite clearly a woman will be saying they, there, that's, that's, again, that's a sort of defiance of language, because they, there's a plurality, but then you can see quite singularly that this is an individual female.
With this, I don't agree with you, Manik. I mean, two things came to my mind. First of all, when you were talking about words and definitions and language, what came to my mind is that with woke ideology, with the cult, they use, and that touches upon what you were talking, Rachel, about whether people, normal people, not academics, they care about what's going on, and about these discussions, is that they use words that everyone understands and agrees with because of the compassion and goodness in their heart, but they use them in a way that actually is weaponized and actually demolishes, destroys our society. So that was the first thing that came to my mind, Manik, when you were talking about the language. So, you use the word anti-racism and you think, yes, of course I'm on that. But then they want to segregate people, in universities or in the public spaces out of their goodness, right? Or they talk about equality, but then all of a sudden you wake up and there is no women-only spaces like changing rooms, prisons, swimming pools. So that was the thing that came to my mind. And then when you were talking about the pronouns, first of all, there's the compulsion that I'm supposed to use the ones that you assign to yourself, but then putting it in your profiles on social media, it's signaling that you are up with the gang. And if you don't use it, that means you're not part of the gang and you should be destroyed. And in a sense, it acts in the same way as policing, like within a mafia community or like in extreme religious communities, where if you're not dressing the certain way, that means you are this and that means you are a target for being attacked. So it's not so innocuous that you just choose to put the pronouns and that's it, and it doesn't mean anything. It's actually very dangerous.
I mean, I would agree it's very dangerous and it's kind of slipped in. I mean, most people aren't listening to the academics pontificating, but what's happening is from these debates is it's seeping into our culture and it's affecting people's daily lives, like the gender debate and the pronouns and stuff like that. It just suddenly appears, and then if you dissent, or you can't even question it. People don't even know why, and they're made to feel too frightened to ask why, so there is no debate. So it's like a game of opposites. You know, they're saying we're anti-authoritarian, yet they're enforcing all these rules on us. Do you see what I mean? So it's just, all the time it's opposites, and it just actually makes you go a bit mad. And it makes you lose confidence in yourself, and it makes you lose a sense of self. And I think that's affecting people's mental health to a degree. So that's why I don't think it's very useful. Well, I mean, it's like anything. Postmodernism is like alcohol. If you have a drink, it's great. Loosens the tongue, and you get things done. And if you drink too much, you fall flat on the pavement, don't you, Manic? Sorry.
That's all right. You can reveal a personal story I told you.
Weaponising it.
Esme, what are your thoughts? I think, just thinking about that suddenly language is called into question within postmodernism, and the everyday commonsensical way of how we speak and how we define something is now questionable.
Well, I mean, I think the danger, if I may be a bit controversial, I think the danger that we're seeing at the moment is when people are exposed to this kind of ideology, however you want to define it. I think a lot of reaction, a lot of people is to kind of actually speak in like quite modern kind of terms about it and say like, well, no, it should be about freedom. Like, it's kind of becoming very obsessed with freedom of speech and things like that. And and I think there's justification for that. But I think the problem with reacting to these issues by just asserting freedom is that you end up in a danger of actually, sorry, I'm not articulating myself very well, but you end up in a danger of like not actually having any truths which you do assert, if you know what I mean. Like, it's no use kind of responding to these things unless you can define actually why do we believe in this? So why do we believe that we are, I'm trying being very deliberately quite vague here because it's just such a contentious issue. But I think we need to restore some sense of truth, and I think that that's more important than just simply asserting freedom, I think.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so Marius, if you've got 1 minute to give us your final thoughts, that would be, you don't have to if you don't want to, but if you have any final thoughts, we'll leave you with the last word.
Okay, I will be the first to speak at the very end. I think, well, I would like to finish what I started saying before in reference to the lady from the audience said. I believe that the societies of different cultures, of other cultures, that are getting richer and richer financially, they will enter in postmodernism sooner or later. However, it will be a very different postmodernism in comparison to ours. I can imagine. I read a lot and I read books, I read scripts, so I have a wide imagination. that the civilization of the Far East will have its version of postmodernism. If Myanmar gets richer, will that happen? Yes, but China will be the first in. And I'm very curious what happens if there will be a distraction as a consequence of that, a similar distraction that we can observe in Western societies. And I think that quite soon we will see a film on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have run out of time. 2 hours has passed. I just really want to say thank you for braving the weather in the first snow of the year, I think, or certainly for me it is, and delightful as it is. Thank you for coming to the Ujazdowski and our audience on YouTube, the virtual audience that we can't see, but we know they're watching us. Thank you for tuning in. This recording will be there as an archive, as a resource, as well as the other 5 debates that we've had. So please do look at it. Please share it on the great web of social media. Yeah, postmodernism, I think we are living in it, but we need to find alternatives. And perhaps, as we said, something that is about a sense of authenticity and truth and meaning and community. I would like to thank our wonderful speakers, Rachel Ara, Mariusz Czesnik, if I can get my pronunciation right, and Agnieszka Koleg and Esme Partridge joining us in Cambridge.
London, actually.
Oh, you're in London. You're not in Cambridge today, right?
Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Yeah, that's where his passport is.
Yes, the mystery of the passport. It could be a little short story there, I think.
Definitely not here.
So thank you all very much, and please keep in tune with Ujazdowski. There is a brilliant team behind all this who don't know behind us. We've got our translators. I want to please give them a round of applause. They do an amazing job of translating this whole event, both English and Polish. Our wonderful technicians who make it all happen with virtual technology and the presentations. Everything ran wonderfully smoothly, so please a round of applause to the technical team here, who do a great job. And finally, Anka, who's our production coordinator, gets us all here, books our hotels, makes sure that we all kind of, have a very pleasant experience. So thank you, Anka Kubieska, for organizing all the invisible stuff that makes it all happen. Very, very appreciated. And finally, the Ujazdowski, and particularly the directors, deputy directors, Piotr, Berta, Marcel, Agnieszka now, and Daniel, who gives us wonderful tours here, Emily. So there's a wonderful team of people here, and I think this museum, Contemporary Art Centre, that has a collection, does something that no other contemporary art space is doing. Provocative exhibitions that today was really moving and powerful. Both myself and Rachel feel that, what are we doing moaning in the now kind of Western world, when what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe is a very different worldview. So, I would say let's kind of amplify what the Ujazdowski is doing, not only across Poland, but across Europe and beyond. So I hope to be here next year, organizing these debates with further provocative discussions and issues, myself and Agnieszka, and perhaps some other exciting ventures. So please keep coming here. And thank you all. So good night, and maybe you could say Merry Christmas, because that's not long, and Happy New Year for 2023. Thank you.